Two numbers changed everything: 56% of the world's population and 100% tariffs. That's what BRICS now claims, and what Donald Trump just threatened. In a single week, America went from rattling sabers at China to slapping penalties on Indonesia, igniting a trade war with half the planet. The White House may have thought it was a show of strength, but the markets saw panic. As BRICS expands and the US retaliates, cracks appear not only across global trade, but within North America itself. What happens when the world redraws the economic map and your closest ally reads it differently? For decades, the US dollar wasn't just a currency, it was the cornerstone of global trade. From Shanghai to Sao Paulo, reserves were stacked in greenbacks, and trade contracts defaulted to USD without question. BRICS, at its inception in 2006, was little more than an economic acronym, a polite forum where Brazil, Russia, India, and China discussed development. South Africa joined in 2010, but the group remained a talking shop. US dominance, both in trade and finance, went unchallenged. Canada stood shoulder to shoulder with the US, backing global institutions like the IMF and World Bank, and rarely diverged in major trade strategy. But beneath that smooth surface, tremors were forming. By the early 2020s, dissatisfaction with the dollar-based system began to grow. Countries chafed at Washington's ability to weaponize the dollar through sanctions and interest rate decisions. BRICS started experimenting with the new development bank quietly funding massive infrastructure projects across the global south, and talks of a BRICS currency gaining steam. Then came the great pandemic disruptions, followed by US interest rate hikes that sent shockwaves through emerging economies. By 2023, inflation in developing nations soared while their dollar-denominated debt ballooned. In parallel, a more assertive BRICS emerged, expanding in 2024 to include energy giants like Saudi Arabia and industrial anchors like Indonesia. The message was clear: BRICS was no longer a passive observer of global finance. It wanted to rewrite the rules. And in November 2024, Donald Trump, fresh off a re-election campaign fueled by promises to punish the cheats, escalated the rhetoric. He threatened a sweeping 100% tariff on any nation backing the BRICS financial bloc. What had been an ideological divergence was now a powder keg with a lit fuse, and both ends of North America stood dangerously close. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he did so with a mandate fueled by grievance and economic nationalism. His base demanded payback for manufacturing jobs lost, for the pandemic's global fallout, and for what they saw as decades of lopsided trade. BRICS, especially with its 2024 expansion, became the perfect target. In November 2024, Trump stood at a rally in Ohio and declared, "Any country that sides with BRICS and their fake currency will face 100% tariffs, no exceptions, no apologies." At first, many saw it as typical campaign bluster, but by July 2025, the bluster turned into policy. Although the blanket 100% tariff was walked back to a 10% baseline, the executive order came with teeth. 19% tariffs on Indonesian imports, citing their formal signature to the BRICS Compact. 36% on Thai goods, arguing Thailand's refusal to fast-track US trade guarantees was tantamount to passive alignment with BRICS. The justification? National security. According to the administration, the BRICS pay system and its anti-SWIFT architecture could facilitate sanctions evasion, support adversaries like Iran and Russia, and undercut the US dollar's global standing. The broader agenda was clear: force American supply chains to reshore or ally shore, return manufacturing to the US, or at least to trusted partners. Trump's economic advisors argued this would insulate the US from hostile monetary blocs and create jobs at home. But the reality was messier. By mid-July, reports from trade desks showed turbulence. Semiconductor supply chains reliant on Southeast Asian fabs were disrupted overnight. U.S. auto firms raised alarm over wiring harnesses and components stuck at customs. Soybean exports, already under pressure, faced retaliatory delays in Brazilian and Chinese ports. The bond market reacted harshly. Fewer foreign buyers showed up at Treasury auctions. The dollar remained strong, but borrowing costs ticked upward. Inflation, thought to be cooling, began to creep again. Trump's defenders on Capitol Hill pointed to long-term resilience. But business leaders in states like Michigan and Georgia weren't buying it. They warned of a hidden tax on American consumers and a recipe for recession. Yet the administration doubled down. "This is about sovereignty," Trump tweeted. "The globalists sold out our country for decades. I won't." As Washington embraced confrontation, its northern neighbor began quietly recalculating. Canada, historically one of America's most dependable economic allies, found itself in a uniquely uncomfortable position. On one hand, Canada had long benefited from close integration with U.S. markets, especially under the USMCA. On the other, it had been quietly deepening ties with Asian economies. The 2024 BRICS expansion shook up Canadian trade calculus. Indonesia, now hit with U.S. tariffs, was Canada's second-largest Southeast Asian trade partner. Ottawa didn't immediately rebuke the U.S. policy shift, but actions spoke louder than statements. In early July 2025, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland stood beside a delegation from Jakarta and announced a 7.4 billion Canadian dollars investment deal covering green tech, critical minerals, and LNG infrastructure. The deal signaled that Canada would not follow Washington's punitive lead. Instead of matching U.S. tariffs, Canada fast-tracked its Indo-Pacific strategy, new incentives for firms investing in non-U.S. supply routes, infrastructure credits to expand the Port of Vancouver's outbound capacity, quiet discussions with Vietnam and UAE about digital currency pilot projects tied to BRICS pay. Privately, Canadian officials were frustrated. "We weren't consulted," said one senior trade advisor. "The U.S. didn't coordinate. They just acted and expected us to follow." The business community responded accordingly. Canadian manufacturers began lobbying for expanded access to BRICS Plus markets. Ontario's auto sector, deeply reliant on Asian EV components, pressed for exemptions from U.S. tariffs on parts that crossed the border. And there was another concern, the dollar trap. With global reserves moving away from USD, Canada's own central bank faced a dilemma. Should it keep aligning with the Fed's tightening path, or start hedging toward a multipolar reserve world? Banks in Toronto began diversifying small volumes of foreign reserves into Chinese yuan and Indian rupees, not as a political signal, but a defensive hedge. Meanwhile, media narratives diverged. American coverage focused on betrayal. "Why is Trudeau cozying up to dictators?" ran one headline on Fox News, but Canadian outlets told a different story. "Ottawa navigates trade trap set by U.S. tariffs," read a lead in The Globe and Mail. Still, the balancing act was fragile. A split emerged in Parliament. Conservatives urged caution, arguing that deeper BRICS engagement risked undermining North American unity. Liberals countered that blindly following the U.S. down a protectionist rabbit hole would damage Canada's competitiveness and sovereignty. For ordinary Canadians, the shift was visible but confusing. Prices for certain electronics dipped as BRICS-sourced goods were redirected north, but farmers complained of delays in exporting grain to markets tangled in U.S. tariffs. In short, Canada was not breaking from the U.S., but it was no longer locking arms either. And as Ottawa tried to chart its own course, it found itself pulled in opposite directions, toward loyalty and toward opportunity. By August 2025, the situation had calcified into a strategic stalemate. The U.S. tariffs remained in place. BRICS, despite internal friction, held firm on its push to expand financial autonomy. Canada walked a diplomatic tightrope, avoiding direct conflict with Washington, while securing backdoor deals with Southeast Asia and Middle Eastern energy players. But nobody was winning. U.S. exporters, from Wisconsin dairy producers to California chip makers, faced a web of retaliatory measures. In Canada, interprovincial arguments erupted over whether Ottawa should push for exemptions or decouple further. Even the BRICS bloc was not immune. Disputes over how to price energy within the group stalled key infrastructure projects. China's absence from the Rio summit cast a long shadow over unity. The much-hyped BRICS currency remained vague, a declaration more than a deliverable. And yet, for all the dysfunction, the fractures kept widening. A new economic map was emerging, one that no longer had Washington at the center, one that saw Ottawa navigating rather than orbiting. Supply chains once taken for granted were now being rebuilt. Deals once inked in dollars were increasingly denominated in other units. Canadian and American companies alike struggled to predict costs, timelines, or currency fluctuations. The question now wasn't whether there was a winner or loser. It was whether the North American partnership, once a model of integration, was quietly being dismantled by the very forces it once helped shape. In boardrooms, on factory floors, and across port terminals from Montreal to Miami, the uncertainty was palpable. And with elections looming in both countries within 18 months, neither leader could afford to look like the one who blinked first. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a test of resolve, of values, and of what it means to share a continent in a world that no longer plays by the old rules. In the coastal town of Prince Rupert, British Columbia, the summer of 2025 was supposed to be a turning point. A 3.2 billion Canadian dollars liquefied natural gas (LNG) terminal project had finally broken ground after years of environmental reviews and diplomatic hurdles. The deal, inked with Indonesian and Qatari firms in early 2025, was seen as a milestone. Canada stepping into its long-promised role as a global energy supplier beyond US pipelines. Then came the tariffs. Trump's 19% levy on Indonesian goods didn't technically apply to Canadian LNG, but the political chill sent shockwaves through the financial sector. Insurance rates on joint ventures with BRICS nations soared. Logistics partners hesitated. The Indonesian firms, worried about secondary US sanctions or reputational risks, paused 2 of their planned investments in the project, delaying equipment imports and workforce deployment. The local impact was immediate. Over 1,200 construction jobs were deferred. A ripple effect hit small contractors and indigenous businesses in the area who had prepared for the boom. Housing projects and training programs scheduled around the LNG expansion were abruptly frozen. Worse, uncertainty infected wider Canadian energy ambitions. Alberta's producers, long frustrated by US bottlenecks, had looked to Asian markets as the future. Now, they faced the prospect of being collateral damage in a geopolitical chess match. In Ontario, manufacturers who had pivoted toward BRICS plus supply chains found themselves caught in new customs complications. Delays at ports, currency conversion, hurdles with BRICS pay, and vague compliance standards meant shipments slowed, costs rose, and client confidence dipped. But perhaps most painful was the diplomatic whiplash. Canadian trade officials, tasked for years with aligning North American competitiveness, were now improvising their own defensive strategy. A former trade negotiator put it bluntly, "We spent 3 decades integrating with the US. Now we're reverse engineering our independence on the fly." For Canada, the cost wasn't just in lost dollars, it was in lost alignment. And while the economy hasn't collapsed, the sense of reliability between the neighbors has clearly cracked. In the heart of Illinois, a 3rd-generation electronics assembly plant is facing a crisis it didn't see coming. For years, the facility sourced components from Thailand and Indonesia, assembling affordable consumer gadgets for domestic brands. It employed over 700 people, mostly union labor. When the July tariffs hit, the first signs of trouble weren't loud. They were logistical. Capacitors and specialized sensors got stuck in customs, flagged for origin reassessment. Shipping costs jumped 18%. The company's inventory dried up in weeks. Unable to pass costs directly onto budget-conscious consumers, The firm laid off 120 workers in August and announced it would shutter one of its two assembly lines. And that story wasn't unique. Across the US, small and mid-sized manufacturers, those that Trump once hailed as the backbone of America First, were among the first to bleed. Unlike mega corporations with global hedging strategies, these firms lacked the leverage or capital to reconfigure supply chains overnight. Meanwhile, American consumers began to feel the pinch in less dramatic but highly visible ways. Prices for home appliances and electronics rose by an average of 6% between July and September, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Garden tools, air conditioners, and microwaves, many with components sourced from BRICS-aligned nations, disappeared from shelves or came with higher tags. Inflation, already a political lightning rod, nudged upward again, fueling partisan recriminations. Even agriculture wasn't spared. Soybean farmers in Iowa saw contracts with Chinese and Brazilian buyers fall through or get delayed as BRICS members imposed subtle countermeasures, stricter inspection protocols, secondary tariffs, or bureaucratic slow walking. On Wall Street, investors grew nervous. Foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries dipped 2.1% in Q3 2025, the steepest quarterly decline since the pandemic era. Analysts warned that a prolonged standoff could make U.S. debt more expensive and less attractive. Most strikingly, some American firms began exploring relocation, not back to America, but to third-party countries like Mexico or Vietnam that could bypass the BRICS-U.S. tariff battle entirely. In trying to punish adversaries, the administration had inadvertently encouraged supply chain flight. The result? American workers and consumers paid a price that was supposed to fall on foreign rivals. From rail yards in Saskatchewan to ports in Seattle, the cost of divergence is mounting. What was once the most integrated economic partnership in the Western Hemisphere now strains under competing visions of the future. One, led by Washington, seeks to rebuild walls in the name of sovereignty. The other, emerging from Ottawa, leans into new alliances, carefully but deliberately. Neither path is without risk. Fragmented supply chains, misaligned currencies, and retaliatory tariffs threaten to undo decades of progress. Yet behind closed doors, officials on both sides know no global strategy can succeed if North America fails at home. So where does it go from here? In the race to define the next chapter of global trade, will North America win together or lose separately? You're American or Canadian. Share your story and your view in the comments below.